No gender.
Reinforcing gender.
Binary, exactly. No binaries.
Hello.
Hello.
Live. Hi, and welcome to This Is Not Therapy Hour. Happy Monday. If you're joining us in the chat, good to be with you. Thank you for being here. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach with Effective Artistry, and I'm joined as ever by Brandon Tessers, LCPC, and Caitlin Miller, LPC therapists with Effective Artistry. Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Good to see you.
And you. For the benefit of anybody watching, this is an open conversation, a chance to ask questions of Caitlin and Brandon about anything related to neurodiversity and mental health. I will read out any questions that pop up in the chat. So if you've got a question or a comment, just stick it in the chat and I'll put those questions to you. I kind of take the place of the audience and host. We normally have a topic every week. So I have a topic we can discuss today, but if you have any questions or anything you want to learn about, feel free to pop it in the chat and we can take the conversation wherever you'd like it to go. Effective Artistry is a therapy practice based in Northbrook, Illinois, licensed to work with any therapy clients in the state of Illinois. And there are also some executive functioning coaches who work alongside Effective Artistry, and we can work with clients anywhere in the world. I think that's all my housekeeping stuff. I never know. If there's anything I've missed.
Marie is a fantastic executive functioning coach. You are one of them.
I certainly enjoy it. I hope I'm good at it, but I certainly enjoy it.
Honestly, enjoying a thing and being good at a thing are more or less the same.
Yeah.
You had mentioned having a theme, and maybe this is it, but I know that a couple of weeks ago someone had asked about children with speech delays, and we had thrown out today as a possible time to talk about that. So if that person is here, if you're here, let us know, because that would be great to talk about. Otherwise, we can go with the topic that you were thinking of, Marie.
Yeah, cool. So I sent an article to the Effective Artistry group chat after our last stream last week. It was something I just stumbled upon, but it's a word that came up a couple of times in last week's stream. So it was the concept of shame and how it can affect people who identify as neurodivergent, how we perceive shame, what shame is, what it feels like, and how we can deal with shame. So
I'm going to pull up Brandon and ask us to define shame.
Well, I mean, that's where we would have to start first.
We have to start there. Yeah.
And I'll say I did not read that article. I was not super plugged into the group chat when I was out last week.
I did not either.
Yeah, I don't know why I gave it a justification. I didn't read the article without justification. But I think it is an interesting concept to talk about. So yeah, what do you, either of you or both of you, think about shame? The word, what are we talking about? What do we mean?
Mm-hmm. Caitlin, I'll throw it over to you and I'll add anything that comes in.
Can we throw it over to Brandon and we can who asked the question? What do you all think about shame? Either of you?
All right. I think I don't want to misattribute something. I think this is a Brene Brown thing, what I'm about to say.
Oh, okay.
That the difference between embarrassment and shame is when you're embarrassed, it's that you think that other people might think you've done something wrong. And when you're ashamed, it's when you think you've done something wrong.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Something like that. Yeah. And I think that's a great kind of way of distinguishing those two things.
Yeah.
I agree. Embarrassment is, of course, every word means anything people want it to mean.
Yeah.
But I think it's useful to think of embarrassment as being about how people might perceive you. Mm-hmm. Because you're embarrassed only if other people know about it, generally, is how we use the word. Mm-hmm. Whereas shame is about you have made an evaluation that there is something about you. And maybe this is a Brene Brown thing too, or maybe I'm just making this up, but I feel like I've heard someone also distinguish shame from guilt, as guilt being you feel as though something you did was wrong, and shame being about something you are is wrong.
Yeah, I think that's also a Brene Brown thing. Okay. And just for context, she is a professor and a doctor of social work in Texas and is famous and has TED Talks and a bunch of books. And
she's a social worker? I thought she was a psychologist.
No, she's PhD social work.
Interesting. I know she's a researcher.
Yeah, and she is famous for researching shame, and then
shame is her, or at least was originally her big thing.
Shame is her special interest.
I mean, yeah. And I don't want to claim to know a ton about Brene Brown. I've seen a TED Talk or something like that. But I think, in our culture, any conversation around shame probably should acknowledge or is going to acknowledge Brene Brown, because she's kind of the leading voice on that topic.
Yeah.
I would add, sorry, I had a thought, like embarrassment or guilt are sort of transient kind of emotions, whereas shame is something that can kind of hang around, a little bit pervasive, maybe color your day a little bit more than fleeting moment of awkwardness or embarrassment.
Yeah, I would say my clients generally describe those as more transient, as shame is more internalized and like persistent. Like it sticks with you more.
That makes sense, and I'm glad to know. That's part of why I like to ask because it's not about a right answer about what a thing means, right? We're all sharing what things mean to us, because to me, embarrassment sticks with me. I still think about things that I did as a child that are embarrassing and feel embarrassment and guilt. I probably, again, words mean different things, and I might be using guilt to cover some things that other people would call shame or whatever. But I would say that I personally struggle with feelings of guilt more than with feelings of shame. Quite a bit more.
I would say I'm more of a shame human. So.
Oh, shame human.
A shaman.
A shaman.
A shaman.
Yeah, like that.
No, that's like 10 years from now. Pretend that didn't happen.
Yeah, so generally, I think when people are talking about shame in like the therapeutic context, the context that we tend to talk about it, it generally is in reference to a feeling as though something about me or about the way that I am or the way that I think or feel is bad. I can't necessarily always define exactly how, although sometimes I can. Sometimes I can come up with kind of ex post facto justification, after the fact can come up with some reasoning of why I feel bad about it. But at the core of it, whether there's reason or not, it's just there's something about me that I think is bad. Not just that I don't like, but that I think is bad.
And that can tie into identifying as neurodivergent too, right? Because if you're neurodivergent, you think that there's something about you that is different from other people and not necessarily a positive difference.
Yeah, if you identify as neurodivergent, you definitely think that some of your differences are bad, or you would never have found any value in the concept of neurodiversity in the first place to identify as neurodivergent. There was some feeling of shame that thinking about it as being neurodivergent alleviated to some extent. Probably not completely eliminated.
Yeah, and then I think some people actively identify as neurodivergent and try to work through the internalized shame that they have, but then it like pops up in surprising places and you kind of have to work through it, kind of similar to religious trauma and what people call like internalized homophobia, things like that, where it's like, I'm not doing this well, I'm not doing this right, there's something wrong with me, I'm bad.
I also think, aside from identifying as being different, neurodivergent people tend to tend to think of things in terms of good and bad. That we're making projections about here's a thing, but it's not about what the thing is in and of itself, just observably. It's about what it means or how it might impact or affect things later on, and therefore kind of can be summed up as good or bad.
Wouldn't there be an irony in that if part of neurodivergence is trying to get rid of binaries and good and bad as a binary? And then...
Yeah, well, yes, it is very ironic. And we're talking about the difference between neurodiversity, which is trying to identify, versus people who identify as neurodivergent, which is a very binary way of thinking about things.
Because it's neurotypical versus neurodivergent.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a categorical way of approaching things. And neurodivergent people tend to approach things categorically. It has a lot to do with projecting into the future, like making predictions and evaluating patterns. And so that shame that a lot of us experience, especially for people who identify as neurodivergent, a lot of that originates in drawing conclusions about how everyone else is, and then knowing how you are, and there being a difference between those two things in some way that makes it feel like your way is worse than the other way. But shame generally involves that, right? Like if you're ashamed of something in the way we're talking about it, you have to have some expectation, some idea that other people are different than you in that way. One of the like knee-jerk kind of most default responses to someone who's talking about feeling ashamed, not just therapists, like if your friend is telling you that they're ashamed of something, a lot of times the first response anyone's going to give is, oh, everybody does that. Because identifying it as something that everybody experiences reduces that shame.
And I'm thinking about like the beauty of a young child before they do all that comparative stuff and they don't realize that, I don't know, there's something, I just pictured a child running around and having a nice life.
Yeah. There's a web comic called Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal that I think you would probably like. But there's a particular one where it's a child like that and an adult talking. They're sitting like on a hillside looking out at a starry night or whatever. And the kid says something like, I really like drawing. And the adult says, I wish I could remember it exactly, but the adult says something like, well, are you any good at it?
Oh, no.
And the kid is, because it's a common theme on that webcomic is for children to then expound philosophically from that place of like childlike, whatever.
Yeah.
And I wish I could remember all the details, but effectively gets into like humans saying long before there was any concept that it was a thing that you could make a living at, that humans make art and express and dance because it is in and of itself enjoyable without wondering whether or not you are good at it or could potentially make a living at it. And that is something that we kind of teach kids, that
oh yeah,
what are you good at, what are you bad at?
Yeah. And also if you're good at something, then that means you should monetize it as an adult in some way.
Well, and vice versa, that unless you can monetize it, you're not good at it.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Oh, what a world.
Yeah, all kinds of things. Bring us back to shame, Marie. Tell me something about, we didn't read that article. What was the article saying?
Okay, so this article is, I'll just pull up the author's name, Tisha Moon. They're a child and family therapist. And they talk about shame in the context of being perceived as different, not necessarily perceiving yourself as different, but being perceived as different or bad or doing something wrong. And I know there's that statistic that gets thrown out a lot about how kids with ADHD hear 20,000 more negative comments by the age of X than kids who don't have ADHD. And I can't remember where that research comes from, but I do wonder if part of that feeling of shame as a neurodivergent person might be tied in with the fact that you're doing something wrong, or you're not doing something the way you're expected to when you're growing up. You can't do can't finish your homework, or can't get up on time for school, or can't get up on time for work as an adult. Maybe. And
I feel like there were some undercurrents of shame in the comments last week about like sleep schedule and not working as much as her sister and that kind of stuff, and being neurodivergent, and the sister's a workaholic and like that kind of.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Reasonable. What's a reasonable hour to wake up?
Yeah.
A quick logistical thing, Marie. Could you put a link to that article into the chat? Put it on like a banner or something so that we're.
Take me a second.
Shouting out the person who prompted this conversation.
But yeah, I feel like acknowledging as a child either you're exceptional or you are deficient in some way, and that deficiency is different from the norm and that it's bad, would then probably cause some shame, internalized shame, and potentially
Well, sure.
follow you into adulthood.
Yes, and happens for literally every child.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like nobody talks to a child and says, "Oh, here's a thing that you're very average at."
But I think part of what Marie was talking about is like a disproportionate amount of it from the average child.
See, my response to that research, I would love to see that research if you can find it.
Yeah, I popped it in the private chat. I can't add it to the public comments, but there's a link in the chat.
That is wild to me, that figure.
Oh, the 20,000 comments. Oh, yeah. Let me look for that.
And what possible, I mean, unless it's like in a single day, they observe, is 20,000 20,000 times as many or 20,000 more?
20,000 more. I think it's 20. It could be 10. It's definitely one of those two numbers, 10 or 20,000 more.
It's not a multiplier, it's the raw volume.
No. It's 10 or 20,000 more.
I can't imagine what else it would have been. What must have happened is they observed some children and the way that people were speaking to them over a certain period of time. And then, noticed that the ADHD kids got 3 more negative comments in a day or whatever, and then did the math to extrapolate that out to 18 years. Mm-hmm. Because saying that they get 2 or 3 more in a day doesn't sound shocking enough. So we got to I don't know. What would be the reverse? 20,000 divided by 18 years worth of days, But because the funny thing about that to me is, we're not taking into account how much people perceive and remember things. Mm-hmm. And specifically children who are identified as having ADHD, even though that many more negative comments may be said in their presence or said at them, isn't the whole point of ADHD is that they're not likely to pay attention to those at as much of a high, at the same high level as kids who are not identified as having ADHD? And therefore, couldn't we make the argument that the reason that it's said more frequently to them is because they didn't notice it the first time and it had to be repeated? Isn't that the point of what ADHD is, especially in children who are identified as ADHD, is that they don't hear and respond to instructions that are given to them? It's a very salacious piece of research. But
yeah. Here's a line from Tisha Moon's piece. The expectation to look at me when I am talking and sit still, exclamations, as well as the stop doodling and stop chewing on that demand, can cause dysregulation in the nervous system. Regardless of direct or indirect implications to meet societal standards, there is a knowing and awareness that something is different or not right. So I can kind of imagine, I don't need to imagine how your fight or flight response might be triggered by constantly being berated for something you're not doing or not doing properly. Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Maybe that can be connected to shame. I don't know. I'm going to throw that back to you.
See, this is stuff where I want to be real careful about. Correlation is not causation.
Yeah.
Because, look, the specific issues of sit still or look at me when I'm talking to you are used in this piece likely because they have been identified as being very specific ways in which society generally expects a certain kind of behavior, but neurodivergent people tend to behave in a different kind of a way. And I'm 100% on board with that and support that. I think there's more nuance to the conversation and hope that maybe we'll have some time to talk about it. But again, every child and every person is asked to do things that they are not doing. Mm-hmm. Like, even if in response to being asked to do that thing, you then successfully do that thing, you still were asked to do a thing that you are not currently doing. Mm-hmm. So responding to a request to do a certain thing that you're not doing with fight or flight, meaning as though you're going to die, as though there's something terrible and dreadfully wrong because someone is asking you to do a thing, suggests to me that that person already is responding in a shameful way. Being asked to do something that I am not currently doing means I should feel ashamed about the fact that I am not currently doing it.
But couldn't you say that, let's say a parent asks a child to do something specifically, and potentially because of their ADHD, it's quite hard for them to do it, and they don't, and eventually they internalize it as shameful because initially it was just a request, but then they turn into fight or flight because they have problems actually doing it.
Unless that parent is responding by causing harm to the child, then it is still, at the end of the day, someone responding to a request, a relatively benign and reasonable one, even though it is an uneducated, in the case of like asking someone to look at you when they're speaking to you, it's a reasonable and relatively benign request. It is an uneducated request. It lacks nuance. And if we get into doing harmful things in order to enforce that behavior, then that's a problem. But don't neurodivergent people don't we also ask people to accommodate us with the things that we would prefer? Like, for example, please don't look at me when I'm talking to you.
Never.
Right? That's why I respond to these kinds of things this way, is because the implication then is that a person shouldn't ask any other person to do any kind of a thing.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to think of counter arguments, but I would say what clients usually say to me is there's some memory in which they were being actively shamed by some sort of either caregiver or teacher. Like, you are really effing up, and like it has to do with a manifestation of your neurodivergence.
Which absolutely happens. And to me, that's the part we should be focusing on. Not the request, but the explicit statement to the child that they are bad for failing to fulfill the request.
Yeah.
Because who's dealing with a crap ton of shame is parents and educators who are trying to help young children. They don't want to mess it up. And especially adults who are aware of neurodiversity or neurodivergence, and therefore are aware of the fact that they don't know all the rules on what to do and what not to do, and are then caused a lot of anxiety by the fact that they know that there are rules about what to do and what not to do, but that they don't know those rules. And so then they're not exactly sure how to interact with the child at all, and end up just kind of not interacting with, like, doesn't that sound familiar? Not knowing the rules, but knowing that there are rules that you don't know and feeling too anxious to even try to engage with somebody. I don't want to, even through implication, reinforce this idea that there are rules about good and bad.
Yeah.
So I don't want adults to get the sense that saying, hey, can you look at me when I'm talking to you, is bad.
I think about tone and context. Like, if you're screaming it at someone, or you're saying, if you don't look at me, you have to stay in your room for a day and we're not going to feed you or give you any water. Like something,
harming a person
like harmful
is causing harm.
Yeah, or like a teacher being like, everyone else can do this and you're such a loser that you could, something like that. So I'm thinking about like tone and context versus the actual request itself, which can be benign or
tone,
even, like,
context, and follow-up.
Yeah.
Really, like what happens next. Asking someone to look at you when you're speaking to them, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
If they don't look at you and then you yell at them, there's something wrong with that.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of my neurodivergent clients have memories like that, where it's some significant punishment that instilled a sense of shame.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
And shame, one of the biggest problems with shame, one of the things that makes it so difficult to address as compared to like anger or sadness or anxiety, is that the act of revealing to another person is the thing that shame precludes you from doing, right? Like, if I'm anxious, I can tell somebody about that and we can talk through it. If I'm sad, if I'm angry, I can work through it with somebody. If I'm ashamed, it's very difficult for me, because of what shame is, to share that with somebody else. I don't want them to know about this thing that I am ashamed of. And so it's difficult to address.
Yeah.
And what am I trying to say? If we conflate the fact that someone did a harmful thing, or a harmful thing itself being done, if we conflate that with another thing which is not harmful, but which the same person did previously, right? Then we start to make these connections and then respond in the future to anyone making a request of us as though if we don't do it, they will beat us.
I would say that could be thought of through the lens of trauma, sort of like,
yeah,
if at some point someone made a request of me and it was harmful, and then my body and my brain
the response to it, the request, I mean, some requests are, I suppose,
yeah.
That's what I'm saying. It's important, I think, to distinguish the two.
Yeah, but I do think someone could literally make her. Oh, Marie just disappeared.
Oh, shoot.
Oh, Marie!
Okay.
Into the void.
Well, it's just you and me for a minute.
Okay. So they make a request that perhaps is harmful in the request, or there's like a punishment associated with it, that if that is then associated with having a really negative experience, and then the brain internalizes that as a fight or flight response, then you, maybe in adulthood, with a benign request that's technically the same, you have, is this too much? Then you have the association that is fight or flight.
I'm with you. So what I find with my clients, and I'm guessing you probably will agree with this, but
Marie, can you hear us and see us?
Yep.
Okay.
I'll be curious to get your take. What I find with clients is they, because of whatever has happened, I mean, depending on what your theories are about why people are the way they are, whatever. So without getting into the because, but that they think of making a request as in and of itself a harmful or potentially harmful thing. Typically, that means that they're thinking of people in their past who have made requests of them as being bad people, mean, hurtful, abusive, whatever, for having done all that. They don't like that. They don't like those people. They don't want to be like those people. Which now they've internalized that they should not ask for help. They should not make requests of anyone. Because if they do, they're being harmful, or they're being a burden, or they're pestering or putting their crap on someone else. I find that to be a very common struggle for clients.
Well, and if that's like a double-sided coin, I think the other side of it would be that when people ask or have a request of them, that they feel obligated to fill it no matter what the cost.
Right.
Yeah.
Which makes it so that they are much less likely, the bar is much higher for them to make a request of someone else, because they're thinking someone else will respond to their question or their request the way that they respond to other people's requests.
Yeah.
Which, different ways of saying the same thing, which is that a request means you must do this or else.
Yeah.
That's why I want to like distinguish the two things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's nothing wrong with making a request. I really want neurodivergent people especially to be able to internalize that. I don't like the message that has been given to neurodivergent people especially, that other people have been jerks by asking things or expecting things of you. They weren't. They were jerks potentially and probably likely because you didn't meet those expectations or fulfill those requests. But try and interact with another person without having an expectation. Like, if nothing else, you have an expectation of how they will interpret what it is that you're doing. And then what happens when you're on the other side? When you're the adult with a child, or the educator with a student, or the therapist with a client. And now all of a sudden you're thinking, oh, if I tell this person what I would like, they might feel some pressure to do that they otherwise wouldn't have felt. So I can't tell them what I would like.
Well, and I think something that can be helpful to clients sometimes, obviously not all the time, is to remind them that there can be like consent within the process of requesting things, and that someone has the ability to say, no thanks, or I'll do that later, or I can't do that now, but I could do this, or I could do half of it, or could we meet halfway, or something like that. And I feel like that.
I want everybody to make more requests. And as long as it is paired with that to me, I agree. That's the important part, is that you have to respond to a denial of your request in a way that's not harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the trap that neurodivergent people especially get stuck in is because they think making a request is such a big deal and a terrible thing.
Mm-hmm.
By the time they actually get around to making the request for help, it is a big deal and things are really terrible to the point that they have justified, no, it is okay for me to ask this now because things are so bad or this person's been so egregious or I need it or whatever.
And I think sometimes clients will come into therapy at that turning point because they might feel shame around asking the people in their like waking daily life these things, and then they're like, I really need help now, like this is becoming a blank show.
Yeah, it's that need help thing that keeps popping up. Yeah, I agree with you. But yeah, the problem with that is that it often then does become that by the time you are making a request, you do respond to the person who declines the request in a harmful way. You get mad at them, you cut them out, you make them feel bad about themselves because by the time you've asked it, it is something that you need now.
Like an emergency.
Whereas if you had asked it when it was a very low bar, then if someone says, no, I'm not feeling that or whatever, it's like, okay, I respect that. But if it's like, no, if you don't do this, I will die. No, then you're reinforcing the pattern of, yeah, you are being a burden when you make requests. If every request you make is you have to do this now because it's so bad.
I do think there's an intersection between people who are marginalized in society and asking for what you want and what you need as well.
Oh, yeah.
So,
well, you were just saying, without going into details, that you were hanging out with a group of people who were very happy.
They were like, I need this. Okay.
And with whom politically you disagree.
Yeah.
And there's something to, I think, I've not been shy about the fact that I would consider myself to be very progressive, politically speaking, or in many ways. I think there is something to the fact that people on that side of the spectrum tend to enforce feeling bad, or have, not all of us, but we have collectively more of a tendency to enforce feeling bad as though it is in and of itself helpful. Like, you should be more aware of these people's suffering. You can't do anything about it, but you should pay close attention and feel really bad about it. And if you don't, that's not good. They're like, if you are to be happy, well, there are a bunch of people in the world who are struggling. You shouldn't be happy. You're dismissing them, right? Like, there is some, I'm not saying intrinsically part of shame or always part of it, but there, to me, is definitely sometimes this idea, this self-reinforcing element of what shame is, that I should feel ashamed. If I let go of the shame and am okay with myself, then that means I'm a bad person.
There's so many things I could say.
We'll say one of them.
I don't know. Oh my gosh. I don't know, Marie. Hi.
Hi. I popped another link in the chat, but it's just appearing in the private chat, so I don't know if anybody watching can see it.
No, you got to put it in the comments.
Yeah, it's not. StreamYard isn't letting me, but I'll pop them on social media afterwards, and I'll stick them on YouTube afterwards. There was an article which links to that study. So it was a study by William Dodson that estimated that children with ADHD receive a full 20,000 more negative messages by age 10 on average. But this particular article is about a study in Japan that says children with ADHD avoid failure and punishment more than others. So that because they potentially receive a disproportionate amount of criticism, they become more sensitive to it, and they tend to become avoiding situations where they may be criticized or punished. So the suggestion here is that it's a self-fulfilling or vicious cycle. And I thinking about how we kind of internalize these things and how we notice patterns and all the rest of it. I remembered something you said, Brandon, before about how we have a tendency, or neurodivergent people have a tendency to emphasize or focus on the negatives. Like it looms larger in our minds sometimes than positive feedback we've had or good things that have happened to us.
I think there are ways in which that is true for sure. So something universal is that all humans prioritize in terms of paying attention to and remembering and thinking about, we all prioritize negative things because that's just evolution. You know, if there's 100 things in a room and 3 of them are potentially fatal, it's important that you notice those 3. The other 97, regardless of how beneficial it might be to notice them, it's not as important as noticing the 3 that might kill you. So we all notice the negative more. And then the second piece is when you are thinking about a thing, specifically when you're thinking about a thing that you are not acting on, because thinking and acting are 2 different things, and you can kind of do them at the same time. That's what we call being careful. You got to you go real slow as you are acting so that you're kind of ping-ponging back and forth in a moment between thinking and acting. When you're thinking about a thing that you're not acting on, if it's one thing, if it's simple, oh, will the sun come up tomorrow? Yes, done. You don't continue to think about that. It's done. So we're not really thinking about things that we feel confident are going to go a particular way. We're thinking about things that could be different kinds of things. It might be useful to think, oh, maybe shame means this, maybe shame means that. Maybe this person will respond to me in this way. Maybe they'll respond to me in that way. Maybe this is the answer, maybe that. And so if you're doing that, then when you consider potential outcomes, well, if I do this, they could respond in this way, and that would be awesome. What else do you think about at that point? You either go act on it or you're done thinking of, nothing left. Or they could respond in this way, and that would be terrible. And there's lots to think about. So the longer you think about something before acting on it, the more and more negative your thoughts will skew. The worse and worse the predicted potential outcomes will get, the more confident you'll become that you cannot navigate it successfully. So what I do think is true of neurodivergent people is that we as a group have a tendency to think about things before doing anything about those things for a longer period of time than the average. And some of that is in the nature of what we're thinking about, right? Like when we are sitting and thinking about philosophy, there's a lot of that stuff that you just don't put into action. It is just thinking. Or like the thoughts that will cause me the most distress, things like, oh, am I going to go crazy someday? Like, what am I going to act on? Like maybe. I don't know what. Am I secretly dying of something? What am I going to act on? Except go to the doctor or whatever. So I do think that neurodivergent people tend to spend more of their resources, more of their time and energy and whatever interacting with crap in their head that is fearful or negative or shameful. And I think that has to do more with the pattern of thinking than it does with the way we're thinking.
I would say that probably, and Brandon, you're welcome to challenge this, is that if there's a continuum or a spectrum of body versus mind, that neurodivergent people heavily veer towards the mind part and the body part much less. So then if more neurotypical people are more either balanced or maybe even more in the body than in the mind, then they might also come up with less problems, think about less problems, have less rumination, think about less negative outcomes, and then all of that kind of.
Well, yes, I agree with all that. And kind of the whole point of neurodiversity is that there must theoretically be some advantage to being balanced toward the mind as well as some disadvantage. And as always, we're going to focus on the elements that are problematic for us, right? Like every single one of my clients ever has said, I overthink things. I've never heard any person ever say I underthink things. I have clients diagnosed with ADHD who talk about how impulsive they are, and I ask them for an example of what they mean, and they say, well, I've had this impulse to quit my job for 6 months now. It's like, that's just a thought or a desire. You didn't do it. That's the opposite of impulsive. But it is that shame we identify. That's I feel like I'm being a little esoteric or academic about this, but the whole framing of the conversation about this stuff, I think, is a problem. Because if we justify, oh, well, it's okay for that kid not to look you in the eye when they're talking to you because they're neurodivergent, but that kid's not neurodivergent, so they should look you in the eye. Or that you have to justify why you don't want to fulfill, or you can't even say it as I don't want to fulfill your request. It has to be I am incapable of fulfilling your request because of X, Y, or Z.
Or you're such an asshole for even asking me.
Right, which would make then me be an asshole for asking anybody else for anything later.
Yeah. And I wonder why I'm so alone and so sad.
Yeah.
What did you say, Marie?
I was just going to say it's because that language is slipping back into the deficit model and the medical model, right?
Right. If anything which is exploring any of these diagnoses through the lens that they cause certain experiences or behaviors, as opposed to the idea that they are simply labels for patterns of experiences or behavior that we notice. They are not the cause.
Mm-hmm.
The sun doesn't come up every day because I say that it will. It is accurate to say that the sun comes up in the morning. It's not coming up in the morning because I have said that it will.
Mm-hmm.
So a child is not behaving in a certain way because they are identified as having ADHD. We identify them as having ADHD because they are behaving or experiencing things in a certain pattern. ADHD is just the word, the construct we have come up with to describe a set of experiences, behaviors, etc.
Brandon, I'm curious if you had, this is a very binary question, but if you had the option to culturally remove any aspects, okay, so culturally remove the DSM completely, and then all of the implications that DSM has had on mental health, would you do it?
No.
Interesting.
No, because the DSM is a very useful tool for what it is useful for. The problems with the DSM is that people attempt to use it for a thing that it is not meant to be used for.
Yeah.
The DSM is a tool for medical intervention.
Mm-hmm.
And I would not want to take away anyone's access to medical intervention.
And by medical intervention,
medication.
Medication. Yeah.
Primarily medication is what we're talking about. But in certain cases, especially things where we're talking about gender dysphoria and things like that, there are other procedures involved.
Yeah.
It's not all medication, but it's primarily medication. And I would not want to take away anyone's access to medication. Mm-hmm. Now, if our culture was structured in such a way that we didn't need to be able to label something in order to have access to the thing which is beneficial. You know, my doctor at one point early on in my process of getting ADHD meds said, like, look, if I prescribe such and such to anybody, they're going to feel some benefit from it. Mm-hmm. And my immediate thought was, then, well, why can't anybody just have it? Mm-hmm. And I know that there are risks and downsides, and there are reasons that we have gatekeeping involved, and medical field is not my field, so it's not. But the DSM is useful. It is so useful to someone to be able to say, oh, these experiences that I've been ashamed of, that I thought were just about me being a bad person in some way, is actually because I have ADHD. Mm-hmm. Does the fact that I think of all those experiences being caused by my ADHD, does that also have its limitations and potentially cause problems? Yes. Mm-hmm. But it's still better than what they were feeling before. In other words, to go from, if I'm struggling to do what people are asking me to do, I'm bad, to, no, I'm struggling to do what people are asking me to do, either because they're bad or because I am, have ADHD or am deficient or whatever. That's a step forward. That's better. Yeah. I don't want people to stop at that point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's the risk, is that you get so much relief by getting to that point that the next step of, okay, and I can change myself to some extent, like any person can, right? Like I grow and develop and learn and change over time. I am not doomed to be and experience exactly the same thing for the rest of my life. But that becomes a little tricky for people when they're dedicated to the medical model, because if they acknowledge that they are capable of learning to or changing in a way to be able to do something that they haven't been able to do, then that invalidates their diagnosis to them. Oh, so I could have been doing it all along? It is just laziness?
Yeah.
So no, I wouldn't take it away. I'm not trying to take it away. I'm just trying to add on that next piece.
I feel like an exception, though, and I don't know if this is just overly contrarian or whatever, but would be, let's say, someone getting diagnosed with borderline personality.
Oh yeah, there are things in the DSM I would take away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And borderline personality is the first one that comes to mind, but
Yeah.
really all personality disorders.
Yeah.
So we're
Because-
not anti-psychiatry.
What's that?
What?
We're not anti-psychiatry. We're just not too thrilled about the pathologizing of every human behavior. Would that be
I'm not anti-psychiatry. I am against the idea that psychiatry is the only lens.
only answer? Yeah.
That there's nothing that can be done for a person except for medical intervention,
Mhm.
or that the origin of a person's experiences that are detrimental or unenjoyable to them, the things that they want to change, that those origins are always and 100% only organic in nature.
Mm-hmm.
I have ADHD because my brain is structured differently, is a nonsense statement. Because we don't have any evidence to suggest that.
Mm-hmm.
People have been, you know how many millions of dollars have been invested into research to try and find the organic elements that make someone autistic,
Mm-hmm.
and they have found nothing.
Imagine if that money had been poured into developing supports for people who are autistic.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But even we ourselves, if we say things like, because I am autistic, I therefore cannot relate to other people or deal with changes to my routine, things which will happen over the course of your life. And so therefore you're saying there's just pain I am destined to experience.
Mm-hmm.
Then why wouldn't even someone who genuinely cares about you, why wouldn't they try and find ways to make it so that you're not that way anymore?
Yeah.
That's why the medical model neurodiversity is in opposition to the medical model. It's saying the way I am does mean that I have experiences that I don't like, but it also means that I have experiences that I do like. If there's anything about you that only results in things you don't like, you should want it gone.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you? If it's only bad stuff, why wouldn't you want that to be different?
So we've got about 10 minutes left. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Please. We got way off track on shame. I mean, I think to me, all this is about shame, but
it all ties in. Yeah. So I just wanted to come to maybe a potential solution for people who experience shame. I'll just cite some of the stuff in this piece that I had linked to. Kristen Neff, PhD, pioneered the study of self-compassion, stating that self-compassion is turning compassion inward. And further up in the article, it mentions shame as disgust turned inwards. So this is the other side of that.
Yeah.
So Neff identifies 3 elements of self-compassion. I'd like you guys to talk about this. Number 1, self-kindness versus self-judgment. Number 2, common humanity versus isolation. And number 3, mindfulness versus over-identification. Mm-hmm. So the one that jumped out at me there is common humanity versus isolation, because I think that's one we struggle with if we identify as neurodivergent, because we already feel different and isolated.
I mean, I'm making a lot of assumptions about what that person means by those things, but all of them sound like things that we've been talking. All 3 of those sound like things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And to me, practical advice with shame is very simple, not easy necessarily. Sometimes so costly as to effectively be impossible because you can't afford it. But talk to someone about it. That's it. The thing about self-compassion, anything which has self hyphen appended to the front of it is a thing which is not a thing that we give to ourselves. Like putting self in front of compassion is something which is necessary, because compassion is not a thing that a person gives to themselves. We have to modify the word in order to make it something that you do for self-care, self-love, self-acceptance. These are words that are describing how other people interact with you or think of you or treat you. And it's not that we shouldn't do those things. Those things are all very good to do. But okay, common humanity versus isolation. And you're supposed to accomplish that without connecting with anybody else, just by yourself.
Yeah.
Tell yourself that you are not different than other people. Like people who are experiencing shame have not already tried that. Like if they didn't already think that they're different than everyone else, then why would they be experiencing shame?
Hmm.
And how are they going to get any evidence that allows them to change their opinion and realize that, oh, maybe I'm not a unique weirdo in this particular way?
I guess the phrase that comes up for me is healing within community or within relation with others. So, you know, kindness, I wrote these down. Kindness, common humanity, mindfulness. So I guess part of what I'm thinking your point is, Brandon, is like by connecting with another person, naming the shame, and perhaps the person's reaction is more accepting and they might be surprised by like the reaction, like, oh, that I actually don't think of that as shameful, or I enjoy that characteristic of you, or you're not alone in feeling that way, or some sort of like positive reinforcement that in the context of the relationship, there can be some level of, you know, kindness and acceptance.
And the self-compassion, all these things that were just mentioned, right? These three elements are all very important and helpful things to get a person to shift from not being willing to discuss it with someone else to being. The point of them is to get yourself to a point where you can share it and talk it through with someone else.
Well, and I also think of them as
not
like,
to make it unnecessary.
Yeah, I think of them as reinforcements to do outside of the context of relation with others. So like when you're alone at the end of the day and no one's with you, that you practice those things, but it's not that those things are the magic cure to get you out of it. I think a lot of it becomes relational and community oriented.
Yeah. And shame is reinforcing, like we talked about, because it isolates you, because you don't share it. Also, a funny thing about the concept shame is that we almost exclusively are applying it to things that we don't think are worth being ashamed of. You know what I mean? Like, we don't say that, oh, this person feels a lot of shame about being a serial killer. You know, like anything that we're saying, no, you should feel bad, that is bad.
Yeah.
We don't talk about shame there. We're talking about shame only when it's something where it's like, yeah, as soon as you share it with people, you realize that's not worth feeling bad about.
And I think to bring it back to Brene Brown, I feel like her main antidote to shame is vulnerability. I think that's the main thing she talks about. And I feel like the kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness also have something to do with vulnerability, like healing in relation to others. So if you practice vulnerability in the context of naming your shame, you can process it and let it go and perhaps feel more of a sense of common humanity.
Yeah.
And I want to share this because I loved it. So I was listening to an interview with Gabor Mate, who, whatever, famous, blah, 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 trauma, that, and also some not great ideas about ADHD. I'm not trying to say he's like awesome and all, whatever, not
What's
totally.
The element that you
But anyway, the thing that I loved is he said that like a tree does not grow anywhere where it is not vulnerable, and that like the new buds and the new like leaves, like, you know how like the stalks might start out green and then eventually they turn brown as they like harden or whatever. And I was like, that is so cool.
Yeah.
I loved it so much.
I do like that. And I like talking about vulnerability, which is about being willing to take a risk, right? That you're sharing somebody with something, or sharing something with somebody that you think has the potential to be used to harm you by sharing, that you have exposed yourself to potential harm. You've made yourself vulnerable. So the self-compassion is something that works on getting you to a place where you can be vulnerable with someone. And you do have to be vulnerable and share the thing of which you are ashamed in order to be able to go through the process of getting feedback from other people. Because shame does originate in other people, our idea about what other people would think, not like embarrassment in that I don't want them to know because it's embarrassing, but in the sense of what you think is good and bad about yourself was originated in what messages were given to you about what is good or bad about you, or what is good and bad about people. And so it has to be resolved with other people.
And I feel like the most basic form of therapy that doesn't even include any necessary like psychological interventions is the client to voice to the therapists themselves and what they're ashamed of, and then for the therapist to still accept them and care about them in the face of that. And I think that can be a powerful aspect of therapy.
The most powerful thing, therapy or not, is to just be heard and understood, which those are what we are encapsulating in those terms, is that a person is able to respond to you in a way that they would not have been able to respond without information you just gave them, right? If they just say, "Oh, you're fine," well, they could say that no matter what. So that doesn't make me feel heard. I need to know that the specific thing I was giving across, and a very basic, like paint by numbers therapy version of that is reflection, just stating back what they said. And then the other element is that understanding or acceptance, which just means you don't treat me any worse afterwards. That you do treat me differently because you have information about me now that you didn't have before, which impacts how you think of me and treat me, but not worse.
Yeah.
You don't give me the impression that you think less of me.
Yeah.
A couple practical quick
minute.
things. Okay. Because to me, it comes back to language, and we could talk about these things in more time another time. Stop using the word need unless you use it in a phrase of, I need to X in order to Y. I need help. Stop saying that. I want help. I would benefit from help. Or I need help with whatever specific thing in order to have whatever specific thing. And I feel bad is a phrase that neurodivergent people especially use a lot. Eliminate that to the best of your ability from your language. When you catch yourself saying, "Oh, I feel bad because I didn't respond," or "I feel bad because they don't have this nice thing that I have," try to replace it with "I wish" or "I would prefer" or whatever, and then state the thing that you want to happen instead. Because otherwise, and this is a real challenge for me, I still all the time catch myself saying, "I feel bad." No, I don't feel bad. I would prefer, I wish, whatever. Because the words that we say are the things that we remember. And if we say "I feel bad," even if you're not feeling bad in the moment, you end up feeling bad. And if we connect "I feel bad" to, I feel bad for this person because blah, blah, blah. And then later on, I don't feel bad and I'm happy. That also makes me feel like, oh, now I don't care about the person anymore.
Yeah.
My caring is wrapped up in feeling bad. But feeling bad does not help anybody. Everything you care about, everyone you care about does worse the worse you feel, and does better the better you feel. So it's a weird disconnect, but it is helpful to everything you care about to feel better.
Yeah.
Which, oftentimes just makes us feel bad about feeling bad because we know a thing would be better if we
And then I think about like feminist manifesto, unabashed pleasure and happiness and no shame in it.
Joy. Trust your instincts for joy. The same way that you trust your instincts for pain.
We need that in the world right now. Please, everyone, multiply it.
Yeah,
please.
Just a simple flipping things around. Everybody to this point is, if you're doing something you don't like, you don't need to have a reason. Obviously, that's a good thing to do. But if you're doing something you like, you need a reason. Justify. Flip that around. Wanting to do a thing or enjoying doing a thing is a reason to do a thing or have a thing. It doesn't need further reason than that. Now, that doesn't mean you should have everything you want, because there are sometimes also reasons not to do that thing. This would be enjoyable, but also would cause harm or whatever. And then doing a difficult or painful or uncomfortable thing, don't do that unless you have a reason for it. And I see that with our clients all the time. I have to do this terrible, difficult thing. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. Why is it the right thing to do? Just because it is. Like, if you don't have a better explanation for why you're doing a thing you don't want to do than just because everybody says so, then don't do it until you have a better reason. And if you can't figure out the reason, but there is one, and therefore you don't do it, well, you'll learn the reason because you didn't do it. If there's some reason that you should have, then you'll experience that.
Yeah. Thank you for your takeaways, Brandon. This was lots of fun.
This was lots of
fun. It was a party.
Yeah.
It was great.
Thank you.
If you were with us in the chat, thank you for joining. Even if you didn't leave any comments, thank you for listening. And looking forward to catching up with you again next week. Same time, same place. Thanks both for being here.
Thank you.
Bye. You're awesome. Bye.
Bye. And broadcast.